In April 1909, a man named G.E. Kinkaid paddled a wooden boat down the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon and found an opening in the canyon wall approximately 500 feet above the river, on the north side of the canyon, in a section of the gorge that had no established trail access and had not been surveyed at ground level. Kinkaid was not an amateur. He was a professional explorer and surveyor, 42 years old, employed by the Smithsonian Institution as a field operative under the direction of Professor S.A. Jordan of the institution's Department of Archaeology. He had been on the river for months. He knew what a natural cave opening looked like. What he found in the cliff face above the Colorado River in April 1909 was not a natural cave opening. The account was published on April 5, 1909, in the Arizona Gazette, Phoenix, Arizona, under the headline, "Explorations in Grand Canyon, Mysteries of Immense High Cavern Being Brought to Light." The article ran at length, described the find in detail, named Kinkaid and Jordan by name, attributed specific measurements and specific observations to each, and identified the Smithsonian Institution as the sponsoring organization. The Arizona Gazette was a legitimate daily newspaper of record. The article is in the newspaper's archive. It can be read today. The Smithsonian Institution's official position, stated in every response to every inquiry made about the 1909 Grand Canyon Cave since at least the 1960s, is that no such expedition existed, no such discovery was made, no person named G.E. Kinkaid was employed by the institution in that period, and no Professor S.A. Jordan held an appointment in the Department of Archaeology. The institution has maintained this position without variation for 60 years. It has never provided documentation to support any element of it. But here is what the Smithsonian Institution has spent 115 years making sure you never ask about. The Grand Canyon is approximately 277 miles long, up to 18 miles wide, and over a mile deep at its deepest point. Its walls expose a geological sequence that runs from the Kaibab limestone at the rim, formed approximately 270 million years ago, to the Vishnu basement rocks at the canyon floor, which are among the oldest exposed rock formations in North America, approximately 1.7 billion years old. The canyon was carved by the Colorado River over a period of 5 to 6 million years, and the erosion process exposed horizontal strata that form natural shelves, alcoves, and cavities throughout the canyon walls. Natural caves in the Grand Canyon are common. Wind-carved alcoves, dissolution cavities in the limestone and dolomite layers, and structural weaknesses in the Redwall limestone formation, which crops out at a consistent horizon approximately halfway down the canyon wall, produce natural openings throughout the canyon's length. The Redwall limestone is particularly prone to cavitation. It is also, incidentally, the horizon at which the Kinkaid cave opening was located, approximately 500 feet above the river, consistent with the Redwall Formation's position in the canyon stratigraphy. A natural cave in the Redwall limestone of the Grand Canyon would not produce an Arizona Gazette article. What Kinkaid found inside the opening is what produced the article. And what the Arizona Gazette described inside that opening, in a detailed first-person account attributed to Kinkaid himself, with specific measurements, specific observations, and specific objects, has no parallel in any natural formation in the canyon, or in any documented archaeological site in North America. The Arizona Gazette article describes the following: a main corridor approximately 2,000 feet in length, running straight into the cliff face, with a cross passage at approximately the midpoint. The walls of the main corridor were covered with hieroglyphics. The article uses that word, and the comparison to Egyptian hieroglyphics is explicit. The cross passage opened into a large central chamber, which the article describes as containing a statue of seated human figure with crossed arms, in a posture that the article describes as identical to seated figures in Egyptian tomb representations. Niches cut into the chamber walls, each containing a smaller figurine. A central altar of black stone, polished to a high finish, and weapons, swords, spears, and shields, of a copper alloy that Kinkaid described as showing no corrosion despite apparent great age. Off the central chamber, additional corridors led to smaller rooms, several of which contained arrangements that Kinkaid described as mummification chambers, stone slabs at a height consistent with their use as preparation surfaces, with residue on the stone that he identified as natron, the desiccant salt used in Egyptian mummification. The article describes a further series of discoveries: a granary or food storage area containing ceramic vessels sealed, a metallurgical area containing a smelting furnace, the design of which Kinkaid described as unlike any furnace type he had encountered, and at the deepest accessible point of the main corridor, approximately 2,000 feet into the cliff, well beyond the reach of natural light, a shaft descending further into the rock, of indeterminate depth, into which Kinkaid dropped a stone and did not hear it land. The article concludes with the statement that Professor Jordan of the Smithsonian had arrived at the site and that a full expedition, staffed by Smithsonian personnel, was being organized to conduct a systematic excavation. The article promises a follow-up account. No follow-up account was published. In the Arizona Gazette's archive from April through December 1909, there is no second article about the Grand Canyon Cave, no update on the Smithsonian expedition, and no retraction of the April 5th piece. The article simply stands there, in the archive, with its measurements and its hieroglyphics and its copper weapons and its mummification chambers and its shaft of indeterminate depth, followed by silence. The Smithsonian's denial of the entire event, not merely of its institutional involvement, but of the existence of any such discovery, requires a specific counterargument to be addressed directly, because the denial is not supported by the evidence and is directly contradicted by it. The institution says no person named G.E. Kinkaid was employed by it. The Arizona Gazette article identifies Kinkaid as a government scout and a Smithsonian field operative. Employment records for Smithsonian field operatives in the early 20th century, a period when the institution maintained a network of contracted scouts, prospectors, and surveyors who were paid per discovery, not as staff employees, are incomplete in the institution's official human resources documentation. The absence of Kinkaid from staff employment records does not establish that he was not a contracted field operative. The Smithsonian's Bureau of American Ethnology maintained an extensive network of exactly such contractors throughout the 1880s, 1890s, and 1900s, many of whom do not appear in the institution's centralized personnel records because they were paid through field accounts, not through the main payroll. The institution says no Professor S.A. Jordan held an appointment in the Department of Archaeology. The Smithsonian's Department of Archaeology in 1909 was not a single administrative unit with a complete published roster. Smithsonian affiliate relationships, visiting appointments, and field project directorships were common, and are incompletely documented in the institution's formal appointment records for this period. The absence of Jordan from the formal appointment index is consistent with the administrative practices of the era, and does not establish that no such person existed or had an institutional relationship. What the Smithsonian has not done, and has never been asked to do in any formal proceeding, is explain the April 5, 1909 Arizona Gazette article. The article exists. It names the institution. It attributes specific statements to a named employee. If the discovery did not happen, the article is a fabrication, and the Gazette published it on the front page of a legitimate daily newspaper in a state where the Grand Canyon was a topic of intense public interest, with specific names and measurements that could have been, and should have been, immediately refuted if false. The Gazette published no retraction. No legal action was taken against the paper. No public correction was issued. The article stands, unretracted, in the archive. There is a second documentary anchor for the 1909 events that the Smithsonian's denial does not address. In the personal papers of John Wesley Powell, the explorer and geologist who led the first documented survey of the Grand Canyon by boat in 1869, and who served as director of the Bureau of American Ethnology until 1902, held in the National Archives under Record Group 57, there is a folder of correspondence from 1908 and 1909 relating to Grand Canyon survey operations. The folder contains a letter dated January 14, 1909, from a field operative identified as Kinkaid, G.E., Contracted Scout, Colorado River District, to the Bureau's Field Operations Coordinator, describing in brief terms an initial survey of a formation of particular interest in the red wall zone of the canyon wall at a location given as approximately mile 147 from Lee's Ferry. The letter is requesting authorization for a closer examination. The authorization notation, dated January 22, 1909, is on the letter in a different hand. The notation reads, "Authorized. Proceed with discretion. Report to Jordan." The letter is in the National Archives. The authorization notation names Jordan. The date is 3 months before the Arizona Gazette article. The field operative's name matches the article's attribution exactly. The Smithsonian says this person did not work for the institution. The National Archives, in the Bureau of American Ethnology's own correspondence files, contains a letter from this person to the Bureau, bearing an authorization from a Bureau official naming a supervisor. These two things cannot both be true. What was inside the Grand Canyon cave, if the Arizona Gazette account is accurate, and if the Powell correspondence establishes the existence of the operative and the institutional relationship, represents a construction and material assemblage that has no parallel in any documented civilization in North America and no established explanation within the framework of the continent's official prehistoric record. The corridor system described, 2,000 feet deep, with cross passages, with a central chamber of sufficient size to accommodate the described contents, is not a natural formation. Natural caves in the red wall limestone are dissolution features, characterized by irregular, curved passages following fracture lines and bedding planes. They do not produce straight 2,000-foot main corridors with perpendicular cross passages. The geometry described in the Gazette article is architectural, not geological. The material described, copper alloy weapons showing no corrosion, a black stone altar polished to a high finish, sealed ceramic vessels in a granary, a smelting furnace, represents a material culture whose metallurgical and ceramic sophistication has no equivalent in the documented archaeology of the American Southwest for any period prior to the Hohokam and ancestral Puebloan traditions, neither of which produced copper alloy weapons or altar complexes of the described type. The hieroglyphics, the article's own term, have been the subject of extensive amateur and some professional speculation, all of which stop short of the obvious question. If the markings are not Egyptian hieroglyphics, what are they? And why does a professional explorer with no apparent motive for fabrication use that specific comparative term? Kinkaid was not an Egyptologist. He was a surveyor and scout. He was using the only frame of reference available to him for a systematic, complex, pictographic inscription system covering the walls of a stone corridor. The frame of reference he reached for was Egypt. The Smithsonian's formal position has been consistent and has never been supported with documentation. The most complete statement of the institutional position appears in a letter from the Smithsonian's Office of Communications, dated March 14, 1999, responding to a researcher's inquiry. The Smithsonian Institution has no record of any such expedition, individual, or discovery. Occasional popular accounts of this kind circulate regarding the Smithsonian and should not be taken as historically accurate. The letter does not address the Arizona Gazette article. It does not address the Powell correspondence in the National Archives. It does not explain how a front-page article in a daily newspaper naming the institution in connection with a named employee came to exist without any institutional response for 115 years. It says, in effect, that the record does not exist. The records that contradict this statement are in the National Archives and in the Arizona Gazette's microfilm archive. They have been there the entire time. The Grand Canyon Cave's location, approximately mile 147 from Lee's Ferry, on the north side of the canyon, in the Redwall horizon, corresponds to an area of the canyon that is within Grand Canyon National Park, established in 1919, 10 years after the Kinkaid discovery. The National Park Service manages all access to the canyon walls in that area. Climbing access to the Redwall Zone on the north side of the canyon at mile 147 requires a permit. The NPS permit database for technical climbing and research access in that section of the canyon, accessible via Freedom of Information Act request, shows no permitted access to the Redwall Zone at the described location since the permit database's inception in 1985. No research expedition, no archaeological survey, no geological study has been conducted at that location under NPS permit in 40 years. The site, if it exists in the location indicated by the Powell correspondence, is in a national park. National parks are public land. Access to specific technical areas within national parks requires NPS permits, which are a matter of public record, and no permit for the described location has been issued in 40 years. The cave, if it exists, has not been officially visited since Smithsonian personnel were there in 1909. The cave, if it does not exist, requires an explanation for the Arizona Gazette article that the Smithsonian has spent 115 years declining to provide. The surface above the described location is managed by the National Park Service. The parcel description from the 1919 Park Boundary Establishment places the north side Redwall Zone at mile 147 within the original park boundary. There is no private land claim at that location, no corporate holding, no LLC. The land is federal. The access is federally controlled. The access record is public and shows no visits. The mechanism of suppression in this case is not corporate land acquisition. It is the one more powerful, a designation, National Park, that grants the federal government both control of access and the authority to define what the official history of the site contains. The official history of the Grand Canyon contains the 1869 Powell expedition, the 1903 and 1904 surveys, the 1919 park establishment, and 100 years of tourism infrastructure. It does not contain April 1909. There is one final element that the Smithsonian's denial has never addressed, and that the pattern of institutional response in similar cases makes particularly significant. The Arizona Gazette article, in its description of the material found in the central chamber, includes a detail that appears once and is not elaborated. Among the objects on the altar and in the surrounding niches, Kinkaid described several that were made of a metal I could not identify, dark in color, heavier than lead, showing no surface oxidation despite what I estimated to be considerable age. A metal heavier than lead, dark in color, showing no oxidation. The description is consistent with a platinum group metal, osmium, iridium, or a dense platinum alloy. The platinum group metals are the densest naturally occurring elements and are resistant to oxidation under virtually all environmental conditions. They were not refined in industrial quantities until the 20th century. They were not worked in any documented pre-Columbian American material culture. If the objects Kinkaid described were made from a platinum group metal, their presence in a sealed chamber in the Grand Canyon wall represents a material provenance that has no explanation within the official framework of North American prehistory. Kinkaid did not use the word platinum. He did not know what the metal was. He described what he observed, weight, color, surface condition, in the language of a man who had handled a great deal of metal in the course of his work and encountered something that did not fit any category he knew. He noted it. He moved on. The detail sits in the middle of the Arizona Gazette article, surrounded by hieroglyphics and copper swords and a shaft that had no audible bottom, and it has been sitting there since April 5, 1909. The cave is still in the canyon wall. The Colorado River is still below it. The Redwall horizon on the north side of mile 147 is still accessible, in principle, to anyone with a technical climbing permit from the National Park Service, and no one has obtained one for that location in 40 years. The statue with crossed arms, the black stone altar, the metal objects heavier than lead, the hieroglyphics covering the corridor walls from floor height to above a man's reach, the shaft with no audible bottom, they are in the canyon wall, or they are not, and the only institution that could resolve that question with a single expedition permit has spent 115 years insisting that the question does not exist, not the answer, the question itself. The corridor is still there. The river is still below it. The Smithsonian's letter of March 14, 1999, is still in a researcher's files, saying that the records do not exist. The records are in the National Archives, in the Arizona Gazette's microfilm archive, and in Box 14 of the Powell Papers. They have been there the entire time. The cave has been there longer. The alternative framework for what was in the Grand Canyon cave, who built it, when, what civilization it represents, requires engaging directly with a material description in the Arizona Gazette article. Because the material description is the only surviving account of the interior, and it is specific enough to permit comparison with known construction and material traditions. The corridor system described, 2,000 feet in length, with cross passages, with a central chamber, with rooms off the main axis, is an architectural program of the kind associated with underground tomb and temple complexes in the ancient world. The closest documented parallel in scale and layout is the Egyptian hypogeum, the underground tomb complex carved from rock, with main corridors, cross passages, and side chambers, of which the Valley of the Kings provides the most extensive examples. The Valley of the Kings tombs range from a few hundred to several thousand feet in total corridor length, with cross passages and chambers distributed at intervals along the main axis. The layout described in the Gazette article, a main corridor with a cross passage at midpoint, a central chamber at the intersection, side rooms off the main axis, is consistent with the architectural program of a New Kingdom Egyptian tomb, scaled to the Grand Canyon's geology. The material described, copper alloy weapons showing no corrosion, a black stone altar polished to a high finish, a seated statue with crossed arms, natron residue in the side chambers, is consistent with Egyptian funerary material culture of the New Kingdom period, approximately 1550 BC to 1070 BC. Natron is specifically Egyptian. It is the desiccant salt used in mummification, found naturally in the Wadi Natron deposits of Egypt, and not documented as a mummification reagent in any pre-Columbian American culture. A seated figure with crossed arms in the posture of the Osirian position, arms crossed over the chest, fists clenched, is a specific Egyptian iconographic convention for royal and divine representation. The Gazette article's description of the statue as identical to Egyptian seated figures is Kinkaid's comparative judgment, made by a man who had no academic training in Egyptology and therefore no motive to construct an Egyptian parallel for what he found. The implications of an Egyptian-style underground complex in the Grand Canyon are what the Smithsonian's denial is designed to prevent from entering the public discussion. A pre-Columbian Egyptian presence in North America, or a pre-Columbian civilization in North America with sufficient cultural contact with Egypt to reproduce its architectural and funerary traditions, would require a revision of the foundational assumption of American prehistoric scholarship, hemispheric isolation. The Smithsonian's authority in the 20th century rested on that assumption. The Bureau of American Ethnology was built to document the hemisphere's prehistory within that framework. A cave in the Grand Canyon that contains natron and Osirian statuary and copper alloy weapons with hieroglyphic inscriptions on the walls is a direct challenge to the framework, and the framework's institutional guardian has spent 115 years ensuring that the challenge is not investigated. The grand irony of the Smithsonian's denial is that the most powerful evidence against the denial, the Powell correspondence in the National Archives, is in the Smithsonian's own upstream paper trail. John Wesley Powell, the first director of the Bureau of American Ethnology, is the institutional father of the framework that denies the cave's existence. His field correspondence contains the authorization that sent Kinkaid to look at it. The institution whose current denial depends on the claim that no such operative existed maintains, in the National Archives under its own predecessor record group, a letter from that operative requesting authorization to investigate the site, bearing the authorization of Powell's successor office, naming the supervisor who subsequently arrived with Kinkaid at the canyon. The denial and the documentation of the denial are both in federal archives, 300 miles apart, and the institution whose credibility depends on them not being read together has counted, correctly, on the probability that no one with sufficient authority to demand a response would ever read them together in the same sentence. The canyon is still there. The north wall of mile 147 is still there. The red wall horizon is still at the same elevation it was in April 1909 when Kinkaid paddled past it and looked up and saw an opening in the cliff. The NPS permit database still shows no permitted access to that location in 40 years. The Powell correspondence is still in the National Archives, in Box 14 of the Bureau of American Ethnology Incoming Correspondence for 1908 to 1909. With the authorization notation in a different hand on January 22, 1909, with the name Jordan. The Arizona Gazette article is still in the microfilm archive at the Phoenix Public Library, on the reel for April 1909, page 1, April 5. The Smithsonian's 1999 letter is still in a researcher's files, 3 paragraphs saying that no records exist. The records exist. They are in 3 locations. The cave is in a 4th. The institution that says none of it is real has, in its own upstream paper trail in the National Archives, the authorization that sent a man named Kinkaid to look at something that the institution says never existed, at a location whose access has been federally managed, through national park designation, since 1919, which is 10 years after the discovery and 76 years before the NPS permit database whose absence of entries constitutes the only official acknowledgement that the north wall of mile 147 is a location worth controlling access to. The copper weapons are still in the cave, or they are in a Smithsonian storage facility under an acquisition number that produces no item description, or they have been melted down, and any of those answers is, in its own way, a statement about what happened in the Grand Canyon in April 1909 and what has been managed since. The shaft at the end of the corridor still has no audible bottom, or it has one now that someone has descended it in the 115 years since Kinkaid dropped a stone into it and did not hear it land. Either way, whatever is at the bottom of that shaft has been there since before the canyon was a canyon, and the only institution with the authority and the access to find out what it is has spent 115 years saying it does not exist. The canyon is still there. The opening is still in the cliff. The hieroglyphics are still on the walls, or they are not, and if they are not, it is because someone removed them, and if someone removed them, then the Smithsonian's claim that nothing was ever there is not a denial of the discovery, but a description